The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through Willowbrook village as Henry Patterson adjusted his leather mailbag and studied the envelope in his trembling hands. 23 years he'd been delivering mail through these winding cobblestone streets, and never once had a letter made his heart pound like this. The address was barely legible, faded ink on yellowed paper that felt impossibly old for something postmarked just yesterday. Clearwater Cottage, end of Rosewood Lane. Henry knew every house in Willowbrook, every family, every story whispered behind lace curtains. But this address, something about it tugged at memories he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream that slipped away the moment you opened your eyes. Young Tommy Burke had pressed it into his hands that morning at the post office, his eyes wide with urgency that seemed far too mature for a 10-year-old boy. "Please, Mr. Patterson," the boy had whispered, his small fingers gripping Henry's sleeve with surprising strength. "My grandmother said, 'This is the most important letter you'll ever deliver. She made me promise to give it only to you, nobody else. It has to be you.'" Before Henry could ask the questions flooding his mind, Tommy's grandmother had pulled the boy away, but not before Henry caught the tears streaming down her weathered face. The old woman had looked at him with an expression that haunted him now, standing at the beginning of Rosewood Lane. It was a look of hope, mixed with terrible sorrow, as if she knew something he didn't, something that would change everything. Now, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ancient oak trees lining the lane, Henry felt an inexplicable weight settle over his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The lane stretched ahead, narrower than he remembered from his years of service, flanked by overgrown hedges that seemed to lean inward, like they were guarding secrets too terrible, or too precious to share with the outside world. His practical mind, shaped by 2 decades of reliable routine, told him this was just another delivery, another name on his route, another address to check off his list before heading home to his quiet apartment above the bakery. But his instincts, honed by years of reading the unspoken stories behind every letter, every package, every worried face waiting at a window, told him something completely different. He'd seen birth announcements that brought tears of joy to grandmothers who had waited years for good news. He'd delivered divorce papers that shattered homes and left children crying in doorways. He'd carried condolence cards that arrived too late, acceptance letters that changed lives, rejection notices that crushed dreams, and love letters that rekindled flames thought long extinguished. But this envelope, with its mysterious weight, and the desperate look in young Tommy's eyes, felt different from all of those. It felt like destiny wrapped in paper and sealed with wax that looked far older than anything from the modern post office. With a deep breath that did little to calm his racing heart, Henry started walking, his footsteps echoing against the cobblestones in a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. Each step took him closer to Clearwater Cottage and whatever mystery awaited behind its door. The leather of his mailbag creaked familiarly against his shoulder, a sound that had been his constant companion for more than 2 decades. He'd worn this same bag since his first day on the route, had it repaired 3 times by old Mr. Jenkins the cobbler, and it had never failed him. Now it felt heavier than ever, as if the single envelope inside weighed more than all the packages he'd ever carried combined. The houses along Rosewood Lane grew sparser as he walked deeper into this forgotten part of the village. Henry realized with a start that made him pause mid-step that he hadn't delivered mail to this section in years. When had these homes become so isolated? When had the path grown so narrow and overgrown? Mrs. Henderson's cottage stood empty, its shutters hanging crooked like broken fingers, pointing accusingly at the sky. The garden that had once been her pride, full of prize-winning roses and carefully manicured hedges, was now a wilderness of weeds and thorns. The Simmons place looked abandoned, its windows dark and hollow, wildflowers reclaiming the front path in an explosion of purple and yellow that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so melancholy. A chill ran down Henry's spine, despite the afternoon warmth that should have made him comfortable in his postal uniform. Something had changed in Willowbrook, some fundamental shift that he'd been too caught up in his familiar routes and daily routines to notice. How long had this part of the village been dying? How many other things had he missed while focusing only on the addresses on his list? The envelope in his hand grew warmer, or perhaps that was just his imagination playing tricks on him. He couldn't be sure anymore what was real and what was his mind filling in gaps with fear and uncertainty. Henry paused at a fork in the lane, consulting the address again, even though he'd already memorized every faded letter. End of Rosewood Lane. To the right, the path continued into deeper woods, where the canopy grew thick enough to block out most of the afternoon light. That had to be it. There was nowhere else to go. As he turned onto the darkening path, a voice called out behind him, sharp with warning and edged with genuine fear. "I wouldn't go that way if I were you, Henry Patterson." He spun around to find old Margaret Wheeler standing in her doorway, wrapped in a thick shawl, despite the mild autumn weather. Her cottage was the last one before the path entered the woods, and Henry had always thought of it as a kind of border between the village proper and whatever lay beyond. Margaret's eyes held a warning so intense that Henry felt rooted to the spot. She'd always been a quiet woman, keeping to herself mostly, but kind enough when their paths crossed. Now she looked at him as if he were about to walk off a cliff. "The cottage at the end," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon something terrible. "Nobody's been there in 30 years, Henry. Not since the incident." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, her knuckles white with the strength of her grip. "Not since what happened to poor Evelyn Whitmore." Henry felt his mailbag grow heavier, the single envelope inside pulling at his shoulder like an anchor. "What incident, Margaret? I've lived here all my life, worked this route for 23 years. How can I not know about something that happened in my own village?" But even as he spoke the words, fragments of memory stirred in his mind like leaves in a forgotten corner, disturbed by a wind he couldn't feel. There was something there, something buried deep, something he should remember but couldn't quite grasp. Margaret's expression grew distant, her eyes focusing on something far beyond Henry, far beyond the present moment. "You were young then, maybe 23, 24, fresh in your postal uniform, so proud and eager. You'd just started your route, full of energy and hope. There was a woman, a widow named Evelyn Whitmore. She lived in Clearwater Cottage with her young son, a beautiful little boy named Thomas. She was waiting for a letter, you see. Every single day she'd wait by her window, watching for you to come down that path, with your bag full of mail and hope." Henry's breath caught in his throat. The name sparked something deep in his memory, like a match struck in darkness, brief and bright and gone before he could see clearly what it illuminated. Evelyn Whitmore. Why did that name make his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name? Her husband had died in the war, Margaret continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone telling a story they'd rehearsed in their mind 1,000 times. Captain James Whitmore, decorated soldier, beloved husband, devoted father. He'd written letters home every week, beautiful letters full of love and hope and plans for the future. Evelyn kept every single one in a wooden box by her bedside. But then he died, killed in action, they said, and she never received his final letter, the one he'd written the night before he died. She was convinced it would arrive, that it would tell her something important, something she needed to know. The military had told her he was gone, but she couldn't accept it, not really, not until she had that last letter. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees with a sound like whispered secrets. Henry found himself leaning forward, drawn into Margaret's story, despite his better judgment. Then what happened? Then one day, Margaret's voice broke, and she had to pause to collect herself. One day the letters stopped coming to the entire village. There was a fire at the regional post office, a terrible blaze that destroyed everything. Hundreds of letters, thousands maybe, all gone in a single night. Evelyn waited and waited, growing more desperate with each passing day. She'd stand at that window from dawn until dusk, barely eating, barely sleeping. They say she stopped speaking after a few weeks, just stopped forming words, as if her voice had given up waiting to speak her husband's name when she finally received his letter. Henry felt the envelope in his hand, burning now, actually burning, though when he looked down, his skin wasn't blistered or red. What happened to her, Margaret? The old woman's eyes filled with tears that caught the fading sunlight. One morning, little Thomas came running into the village, crying and terrified. His mother had been sitting in her chair by the window as usual, but when he tried to talk to her, she didn't respond. She just stared out at the empty lane, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for a letter that would never come. The doctor came, tried everything he could think of, but she wouldn't move, wouldn't speak, wouldn't even blink. It was like her soul had left, but her body remained, trapped in eternal waiting. And then, Henry prompted, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the rest. Then she disappeared, Margaret said flatly. 3 days later she was simply gone. The chair was empty, the cottage was cold, and there was no sign of where she'd gone or how she'd left. Some say she died of heartbreak, and her body was spirited away by angels. Others say she simply walked into the woods and became part of the trees and earth. The darkest rumors claimed she was still there, still in that cottage, still waiting by that window for a letter that burned in a fire 30 years ago. Her son Thomas was sent to live with relatives in the next county. He was only 8 years old, poor child. He grew up without knowing what really happened to his mother, always wondering, always searching for answers that didn't exist. The envelope in Henry's hand suddenly felt burning hot, so hot that he nearly dropped it. He looked down at it, and for just a moment he could swear he saw the ink shimmer and rearrange itself, the date on the postmark cycling through years and decades before settling back to its original form. He blinked hard, convinced he was seeing things, but the impression remained. "That was 30 years ago, Margaret," Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady and rational. "Why hasn't anyone been to the cottage since? Why hasn't anyone investigated or torn it down, or at least checked to see what's there?" Margaret's eyes widened with genuine fear. "Because those who tried," she whispered, "they came back changed. Unable to speak of what they saw, their eyes haunted by visions they couldn't or wouldn't share. Some never came back at all. The village constable went there in 1957, determined to solve the mystery once and for all. He was found 3 days later wandering the village green, unable to remember his own name. Old Peter Harrison went there in 1963, claiming he was too sensible to believe in ghosts. He returned an hour later, his hair turned completely white, and he never spoke another word for the rest of his life. Whatever's in that cottage, Henry, it's been waiting for 30 years, waiting for something or someone, and I don't think it's something of this world." Henry should have felt fear. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn around, to take this impossible envelope back to the post office, to refuse this delivery and go home to his safe, predictable life. But instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose that drowned out the fear like a wave drowning a candle flame. Tommy's grandmother had insisted this letter be delivered. The boy had been so earnest, so desperate. There had to be a reason. There had to be a purpose to all of this. "Thank you for the warning, Margaret," Henry said, touching the brim of his postal cap in a gesture of respect. "But I've been delivering mail for 23 years, and I've never failed to complete a delivery yet. I'm not about to start now." Margaret shook her head sadly. "You're a good man, Henry Patterson. You've always been a good man. But goodness doesn't always protect us from the things that wait in the dark corners of the world. Please, at least be careful. And if you do come back, come tell me what you found. I've wondered for 30 years what really happened in that cottage." Henry tipped his cap to her one final time and continued down the darkening path. Behind him, he heard Margaret's door close with a soft click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. The trees grew denser here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step he took, and Henry's breath began to mist in the air, like it was the dead of winter instead of a mild autumn afternoon. That couldn't be natural, couldn't be explained by any rational understanding of weather or temperature. But then again, nothing about this entire day had been natural or rational. What do you think Henry will find at Clearwater Cottage? Is Evelyn still there after 30 years? Drop your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Village Mailman so you never miss a mysterious delivery. The path curved sharply around a massive oak tree that must have been standing for centuries, and suddenly Henry was there. Clearwater Cottage stood before him like something from a dream or a nightmare. He genuinely wasn't sure which. It was smaller than he'd expected, a stone structure with a thatched roof that somehow looked both decrepit and strangely well-preserved at the same time. The windows were dark, but not broken, their glass intact, despite 3 decades of abandonment. The garden, though overgrown with weeds and wild grasses, showed signs of deliberate order beneath the chaos, as if someone had once cared deeply about these flowers, and that care had left an impression that time couldn't completely erase. Roses climbed the walls in profusion, their blooms impossibly vibrant for this time of year, deep crimson and pure white flowers that should have withered weeks ago. The front door was painted a cheerful blue, the color barely faded, despite 3 decades of weather and neglect. It looked like someone had painted it just last week, and in the window beside the door, just visible through the dusty glass, sat a figure. Henry's heart stopped beating for a full second. He was certain of it. The figure was still, so completely motionless that it had to be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees, perhaps a piece of furniture that his frightened mind was interpreting as something human. But as he forced his feet to move closer, one trembling step at a time, he could make out more details that shattered that comfortable explanation. It was a woman, seated in a wooden chair facing the window, her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a dark dress that looked like it came from another era, and her hair was pinned up in a style that Henry vaguely recognized from old photographs his mother had shown him. He couldn't see her face clearly from this angle, but he felt her watching him. Not looking at him, but watching him, tracking his every movement with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Every instinct Henry possessed screamed at him to turn back, to run from this cursed place as fast as his legs could carry him, to throw the envelope into the nearest fire and forget this entire day ever happened. But he thought of Tommy, of the boy's desperate plea and his grandmother's tears. He thought of Margaret's story, of a woman who had waited and waited for a letter that never came, who had loved her husband so much that she couldn't let go even after death. He thought of Thomas Burke, now a grown man, who had spent his entire life wondering what happened to his mother. Whatever this was, whoever this was, they deserved to know that someone had finally come. They deserved to know that after 30 years, the letter had arrived. With hands that shook so badly he could barely control them, Henry walked up the 3 stone steps to the front door. The wood beneath his feet was solid, no creaking or rot despite decades of exposure to the elements. Up close, he could see that the blue paint was fresh, as if someone had carefully applied it just this morning. The brass doorknob gleamed without a speck of tarnish. This was impossible. Everything about this was completely, utterly impossible. He raised his fist and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing strangely, as if the cottage was much larger inside than its modest exterior suggested. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then slowly, so slowly that Henry thought he might be imagining it, he heard footsteps approaching from within. They were light, measured, the footsteps of someone who had all the time in the world, and no reason to hurry. The doorknob turned with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. The door opened, and the woman from the window stood before him. Henry's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. She was young, impossibly young for someone who should be in her 70s or 80s, if she'd even survived the past 30 years. She appeared to be perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in that old-fashioned style and striking blue eyes that seemed to contain depths of sorrow that no 30-year-old should possess. She wore the same dark dress he'd glimpsed through the window, simple but well-made, and around her neck hung a silver locket that caught the fading light. But it was her expression that stopped Henry's heart and made his breath catch in his throat. Her mouth opened as if to speak, her lips forming shapes that should have produced words, but no sound came out, not even a whisper of air, not the faintest hint of voice. Her eyes filled with recognition, with desperate hope, with a mixture of joy and terrible sorrow that made Henry want to weep. She reached out one trembling hand toward him, then toward the envelope he held, clutched against his chest like a shield. Margaret's words echoed in his mind like a curse. She stopped speaking after a few weeks, just stopped forming words, as if her voice had given up waiting. Henry's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Evelyn Whitmore?" The woman's eyes widened until they seemed to fill her entire face. Fresh tears began to stream down her cheeks, cutting tracks through what looked like years of dust or sorrow or both. She nodded frantically, one hand clutching at her throat as if trying to force words out by sheer physical effort. Her mouth kept forming shapes, kept trying to speak, but nothing emerged except silent sobs that shook her entire body. She looked exactly as she must have looked 30 years ago, not a day older, not a single grey hair or wrinkle to suggest the passage of time. This was impossible. All of it was impossible. Dead people didn't wait by windows for letters. Missing women didn't remain unchanged by time. Abandoned cottages didn't maintain themselves for 3 decades. But Henry was looking at the impossible, standing face to face with it, close enough to see the real tears on her real face and the desperate hope in her real eyes. He looked down at the envelope, really looked at it, for the first time since Tommy had pressed it into his hands. The postmark wasn't from yesterday, he could see that now. As he watched with growing amazement, the date seemed to shimmer and shift like oil on water, showing different years, different decades, cycling through time itself. 1955, 1970, 1983, 2005. Each date appeared for just a moment before dissolving into the next, but the sender's name remained constant, clear and unmistakable in handwriting that spoke of education and care. Captain James Whitmore, Evelyn's husband. The letter she'd been waiting 30 years to receive. The final message from a man who died on a battlefield half a world away, whose last thoughts had been of his wife and son, whose final act had been to put pen to paper and pour out his heart one last time. "I think," Henry said softly, his voice steadier than he felt or had any right to be, "this belongs to you. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you had to wait, but it's here now. He didn't forget you. He never forgot you." He held out the envelope with both hands, presenting it like the precious thing it was. Evelyn's hand shook so violently as she reached for it that Henry thought she might collapse right there in the doorway. Her fingers, cold as ice despite the warmth of the afternoon, brushed against his as she took the envelope from him. The moment her skin made contact with the paper, something extraordinary happened. The world exploded into color. Henry hadn't even realized everything had been muted, like looking at the world through grey gauze or dirty glass, until suddenly it wasn't. The roses on the cottage walls blazed crimson, so bright they almost hurt to look at. The sky above burst into brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple as the sunset painted itself across the horizon. The grass turned emerald green, the stones of the cottage warmed to golden brown, and Evelyn herself seemed to solidify, becoming more real, more present, more alive than she'd been just a second before. She clutched the letter to her chest with both hands, her mouth opening in a silent sob of relief so profound and overwhelming that Henry felt tears spring to his own eyes in sympathy. Her whole body shook with emotion. Decades of waiting and hoping and praying finally answered in this single moment. She gestured frantically for him to come inside, her movements urgent and pleading, and despite every logical thought telling him not to cross that threshold, despite every warning Margaret had given him, despite the impossibility of everything he was experiencing, Henry stepped forward. "Are you still watching? Hit that like button, and tell us in the comments whether you think Henry should have entered the cottage, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next." The interior of Clearwater Cottage was frozen in time like an insect preserved in amber. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, crackling and popping and throwing warm light across the room, though Henry knew with absolute certainty that was impossible. No fire could burn for 30 years. No wood could last that long. The furniture was neat and tidy, doilies on every surface precisely placed, cushions carefully arranged. Photographs in silver frames lined the mantel above the fireplace, and Henry could see they were pictures of Evelyn, a handsome man in military uniform who must be James, and a small boy with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. Everything spoke of a life paused mid-breath, waiting for something that would allow it to continue, waiting for this letter, waiting for this moment. The cottage should have been dusty, cobwebbed, falling apart from neglect. Instead, it looked like Evelyn had just finished tidying up before sitting down to wait by the window. The floors were clean, the windows sparkled, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax. Evelyn led him deeper into the cottage with quick, urgent steps, her hand occasionally reaching back to make sure he was still following. She brought him to a small sitting room painted in soft yellow, where afternoon light streamed through lace curtains that must have been white once, but had aged to cream. She gestured for him to sit in an armchair that looked like it had never been used, its fabric pristine and unmarked. Henry sat carefully, his mailbag still on his shoulder, unwilling to fully commit to staying, but unable to leave. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, holding the envelope like it was made of spun glass and might shatter at any moment. She held up one finger in a gesture that clearly meant wait or one moment. Then carefully, reverently, with trembling hands that could barely manage the task, she opened the envelope. The sound of tearing paper seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cottage, like breaking a seal that had held for centuries. Henry almost offered to help, his hands halfway to reaching out, but something stopped him. Something told him this was a moment too sacred for interference, too personal for anyone else's hands to touch. This was Evelyn's letter. Evelyn's moment, Evelyn's closure after 30 years of waiting. She pulled out several sheets of paper, yellowed with age and fragile as butterfly wings, covered in careful handwriting that Henry could see even from where he sat, was full of crossings out and corrections. The writing of a man who wanted to get every word exactly right, because he knew these might be his last words to the woman he loved. As Evelyn read, emotions played across her face like sunlight through clouds, changing so rapidly that Henry could barely process one before the next appeared. First came recognition, her eyes widening as she saw her husband's handwriting after all these years. Then love, pure and undiluted, softening every line of her face. Then grief, fresh and sharp as if James had died just yesterday instead of 30 years ago. Then joy at whatever words he'd written, whatever promises or memories he'd shared. Then pain, deep and cutting, at the reminder of everything she'd lost. And finally, understanding, a kind of peaceful acceptance that seemed to settle over her like a blessing. Tears fell onto the pages as she read, darkening the yellowed paper in spots, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She read slowly, savoring every word, occasionally pausing to reread a passage or to press the pages to her chest, as if trying to absorb them directly into her heart. Henry sat in silence, witnessing something intensely private and profound, feeling like an intruder but unable to look away from the raw emotion on display. When she finished reading the last page, she stood perfectly still for a long moment, the letters held loosely in her hands, her eyes closed. Then she pressed the entire collection to her heart with both hands and looked up at Henry with such gratitude, such pure thankfulness, that he felt completely unworthy of it. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He'd just delivered a letter. That's what mailmen did. But the look in her eyes told him he'd done something far more important than he understood. Then she did something unexpected. She walked to a small writing desk in the corner of the room, a beautiful piece of furniture with delicate carved legs and small drawers with brass pulls. She opened the top drawer and pulled out a piece of writing paper that looked as fresh and new as if she'd bought it this morning, along with a fountain pen that gleamed in the afternoon light. Her hand moved across the page with urgent, flowing script, the pen scratching softly against the paper. When she finished, she brought the note to Henry with both hands, presenting it to him the way he'd presented the letter to her. The note read, in handwriting that was elegant despite being clearly written in haste, "For 30 years, I have been caught between worlds, Mr. Patterson, unable to speak, unable to leave this cottage, unable to die. My James's last letter never came, destroyed in that terrible fire, and without it I could not find peace. I could not let go of this life and move on to whatever comes next. I became a ghost in my own home, waiting and watching and hoping for something I thought would never arrive. But you, kind mailman, you have freed me from this prison of my own making. My James wrote to tell me that he loved me beyond measure, that our son Thomas must know his father was brave and good and proud to serve, and that I must live, truly live, not just exist in grief and waiting. He released me from my vigil. He gave me permission to let go." Henry's hands shook as he held the note, his eyes scanning the words again and again, trying to make sense of what they meant. "But how is this possible?" he asked, looking up at Evelyn's peaceful face. "How are you here? How am I here? This cottage should be abandoned, falling apart. You should be... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring himself to say what logic demanded. Evelyn smiled sadly, the first time he'd seen her smile, and it transformed her face completely. She took the note back from him and began writing again, her hand moving even faster now, as if time was running out and she had so much to say. "Love is the strongest force in any world, Mr. Patterson," she wrote. "Stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than logic or reason. My love for James and his love for me was strong enough to hold my soul in place for 30 years, waiting for the closure I needed. Strong enough to keep this cottage from crumbling, to keep the roses blooming, to keep the fire burning in the hearth. Strong enough to bring you, a good and faithful mailman, down a path that shouldn't exist anymore, carrying a letter that was destroyed in a fire 3 decades ago. Love makes the impossible real. Love creates miracles when nothing else can." She paused in her writing, looking up at Henry with those impossibly blue eyes, then continued with renewed urgency. "My son, Thomas Burke, received his own letter recently, from me. Somehow, across time and space and the barrier between life and death, I was able to reach him, to tell him about his father, to release him from the burden of not knowing what happened to me. His grandson, young Tommy, was the one who brought you the letter this morning. He never knew where it came from, or how it appeared in the sorting room. I sent it through dreams and whispers, and the love that connects a mother to her child across any distance. I sent it because I knew the time was finally right. I knew my James's letter had found its way back from whatever place lost things go when we think they're gone forever." Henry felt like his entire understanding of reality was shifting beneath his feet, like sand in an outgoing tide. "Thomas Burke," he repeated slowly. "The boy who gave me the letter is Thomas's grandson, your great-grandson. You've been watching over them all this time." Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they seemed like tears of joy rather than sorrow. She wrote one more note, her hand trembling so badly now that the words were barely legible. "I have watched Thomas grow into a good man, despite the pain of losing his mother so young. I have watched him marry and have children of his own. I have watched his son grow and marry and bring beautiful little Tommy into the world. I have been there for every birthday, every milestone, every moment of joy and sorrow, unable to speak or touch or comfort, but there nonetheless, a ghost at the feast of their lives. And now finally I can rest. Now I can let go and move on to wherever James is waiting for me. Thank you, Henry Patterson. You have given me the greatest gift anyone could give. You have brought me peace." "What happens now?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to you? What happens to this cottage?" Evelyn held up the letters from her husband, all those precious pages covered in his careful handwriting, and smiled again. The expression transformed her entirely, made her look younger than ever, filled with a joy and peace that seemed to radiate from her like light. She wrote one final note, pressing it into Henry's hand with fingers that felt warmer now, more substantial, more real. "Now I can finally rest. Thank you, Henry Patterson. You have always been a good man, even if you don't remember the young widow who used to watch for you from her window when you first started your route all those years ago. Watch over my family. They have waited long enough for answers, carried enough pain for one lifetime. Tell Thomas that his mother loved him with every fiber of her being, that she never wanted to leave him, that she would have given anything to raise him and see him grow. Tell him I'm proud of the man he became. Tell him I'm finally free." Before Henry could respond, before he could ask any of the 1,000 questions flooding his mind, Evelyn stood and walked to the fireplace. She took one of the photographs from the mantel, the one showing her with James in his uniform and young Thomas between them, all three of them smiling at some long-ago happy moment. She pressed the photograph into Henry's hands with both of hers, holding his hands for a moment in a gesture that felt like a blessing. Then she gently but firmly pushed him toward the door, her movements urgent now, insistent. Henry wanted to protest, wanted to understand, wanted to help somehow, but Evelyn was determined. She guided him through the cottage to the front door, moving faster now, and as they passed the mirror in the hallway, Henry caught a glimpse of their reflections, or rather, his reflection. Evelyn cast no reflection in the mirror at all, just an empty space where she should have been standing. The sight made him stumble, made his breath catch, made reality tilt even further off its axis. They reached the threshold, and Evelyn stopped there, unable or unwilling to cross. She pressed one hand to Henry's cheek in a gesture of farewell and benediction, her touch as light as a feather and as warm as sunlight. Her lips formed words he couldn't hear, but somehow understood anyway, reading them in the shape of her mouth and the expression in her eyes. Go, live, remember, and thank you. Then she gently pushed him across the threshold onto the porch, and before he could turn back, before he could say anything else, she closed the blue door between them. Henry stood on the porch, the photograph clutched in one hand, his mind spinning with everything he'd witnessed and experienced. He turned back to knock again, to ask all the questions that needed asking, to make sure Evelyn was all right, to somehow help her with whatever came next. But his fist never connected with the wood. The cottage was changing before his eyes. The transformation happened slowly at first, then faster and faster, like a film played at increasing speed. The roses on the walls began to wilt and fall, their vibrant crimson blooms turning brown and crumbling to dust that was carried away by a wind he couldn't feel. The stones of the walls grew moss-covered and crumbled at the edges. The thatched roof sagged and developed holes. The blue paint on the door faded to grey, then began to peel and flake away. The windows, so clean and clear just moments ago, developed cracks that spread like spiderwebs across their surface. Within minutes, Clearwater Cottage looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof collapsed in places, letting in the sky. The windows were broken now, empty frames with shards of glass hanging from them like teeth. The door hung crooked on its hinges, the blue paint completely gone, to reveal weathered grey wood beneath. The garden was nothing but weeds and thorns. Any sign of the beautiful roses completely vanished. Only the 3 stone steps remained intact, leading to a doorway that opened onto rubble and ruin. Henry stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. Had he imagined everything? Had the whole experience been some kind of hallucination brought on by breathing too much of the strange mist that had filled the air when he entered the woods? But then he looked down at the photograph still clutched in his hands, solid and real and undeniably there. The Whitmore family stared back at him from a happier time, frozen in a moment of joy that the camera had preserved forever. Evelyn with her dark hair and bright smile. James handsome in his uniform, pride and love clear in his expression. Young Thomas between them, missing his front tooth, his eyes full of innocence and trust. On the back of the photograph in faded brown ink was written, "The Whitmore family, summer, 1952. May we always be this happy." Henry carefully tucked the photograph into his mailbag, the most precious cargo he'd ever carried in 23 years of service. Then he turned away from the ruins of Clearwater Cottage and began the walk back to Willowbrook Village. The path seemed shorter now, brighter, warmer, as if a shadow that had lain over this part of the woods for 30 years had finally been lifted. The air smelled fresher, the birdsong sounded clearer, and even the cobblestones beneath his feet seemed more solid somehow. Do you think Evelyn finally found peace? What would you do if you delivered a letter like this? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the Village Mailman for more incredible stories every week. When Henry reached Margaret Wheeler's cottage, she was still standing in her doorway, exactly as he'd left her, as if she'd been frozen in place waiting for him to return. The moment she saw him walking toward her, alive and apparently unharmed, her face transformed with relief and amazement. "You came back," she said, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "And you can still speak. You're not like the others who went there." Henry paused on the path, looking at her with new understanding. The others couldn't speak after visiting the cottage because they couldn't process what they'd seen. They couldn't reconcile the impossible with their understanding of reality, so their minds shut down rather than accept it. "But I went there with a purpose, Margaret. I went to deliver a letter, and I completed my delivery." Margaret came down her steps, moving more quickly than Henry had ever seen her move, studying his face intently, as if looking for signs of damage or change. "You saw her, didn't you? You saw Evelyn Whitmore. After all these years, she was still there, still waiting." "I saw her," Henry confirmed quietly, "and I gave her what she'd been waiting for, her husband's last letter, the one that was lost in the fire. Somehow, it found its way back. Somehow, I was meant to deliver it." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Burke has been searching for answers about his mother for his entire life, never understood why she vanished, why he was taken away so suddenly, why nobody could tell him what really happened. It broke something inside him, changed him fundamentally. He became obsessed with the mail service, convinced that somewhere, somehow, there were answers waiting to be delivered. That's why he made absolutely sure that his son understood the importance of what mailmen do, the sacred trust of completing deliveries. And that's why his grandson Tommy somehow knew in his heart that when that impossible letter appeared in the sorting room yesterday morning, you were the only one who could deliver it. Henry felt the weight of understanding settle over him like a mantle. Young Tommy has his great-grandmother's gift, doesn't he? He sees connections that others don't, understands things that shouldn't be understandable. Margaret nodded slowly. The boy has always been special. Even as a toddler, he would talk about the sad lady who watched him from the window when they drove past Rosewood Lane, though there was never anyone visible there. He would wake up crying about a grandfather he never met, describing details of James Whitmore's life that he couldn't possibly have known. His parents thought he had an overactive imagination, but Thomas knew better. Thomas understood that his grandson was somehow connected to the grandmother he'd lost so many years ago. Henry continued his walk back toward the village centre, and Margaret fell into step beside him, apparently unwilling to let him out of her sight just yet. The afternoon was fading into evening now, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold that made Willowbrook look like something out of a painting. The village had never looked more beautiful or more ordinary, but Henry knew now that beneath that ordinary surface lay depths of mystery and wonder that most people never suspected. "What will you tell Thomas?" Margaret asked quietly. "How do you explain what happened?" "I'll tell him the truth," Henry replied, "that his mother loved him with all her heart, that she never wanted to leave him, that she waited 30 years for a letter that would give her peace, and when it finally arrived, she was freed from her vigil. I'll tell him she's proud of the man he became and the family he built, and I'll give him the photograph she wanted him to have." They walked in companionable silence for a while, past the houses with their lit windows and smoking chimneys, past gardens being put to bed for winter, past neighbours calling greetings to each other as they finished their daily tasks. Normal life continuing normally, unaware that just a few hundred yards away something impossible and miraculous had occurred. When they reached the edge of the village green, Margaret stopped and placed her hand on Henry's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for having the courage to complete that delivery, for giving Evelyn the peace she deserved, for giving Thomas the answers he needed. Not many men would have walked down that path knowing what waited at the end. "I'm just a mailman," Henry said, but the words felt insufficient even as he spoke them. "I deliver letters. That's what I do." "You're more than that," Margaret replied. "You're the person who sees beyond the addresses and the names to the people behind them, to the stories that need completing. That's why the letter found its way to you. That's why young Tommy knew to give it to you and no one else. You were chosen for this, Henry Patterson, whether you understand that yet or not." She squeezed his arm once more, then turned and began walking back toward her cottage, leaving Henry standing alone on the edge of the village green as the last light faded from the sky. He stood there for a long moment, his mailbag feeling lighter than it had in years, despite still containing the precious photograph, watching the lights come on in windows all across Willowbrook. Finally, with a deep breath and a sense of purpose he couldn't quite name, Henry turned toward the post office. There was someone waiting there who deserved answers, someone who had spent 30 years carrying the weight of not knowing what happened to his mother. It was time to complete the delivery fully, to give Thomas Burke the closure he needed. The post office was closed for the day, but Thomas Burke was waiting on the front steps exactly as Henry had somehow known he would be. He was a man in his late 40s now, with greying hair and tired eyes that showed the weight of decades of unanswered questions. But when those eyes saw Henry approaching, they lit up with desperate hope mixed with terrible fear, as if he both needed and dreaded what Henry might tell him. "Mr. Patterson," Thomas said, his voice shaking as he stood up from the steps, "my son called me, told me you delivered a letter today to Rosewood Lane, to the end of Rosewood Lane, to Clearwater Cottage." He had to pause and take a breath, his hands gripping the railing tightly. "Was she there? Did you see my mother? After all these years, was she really there?" Henry climbed the steps slowly, giving himself time to find the right words. How did you explain the impossible to someone who had spent 30 years searching for rational answers? How did you make sense of something that defied sense? But when he looked into Thomas's eyes, he saw that the man didn't need rational explanations. He needed truth, whatever form that truth took. "She was there," Henry said simply. "Your mother was there, Thomas, and she asked me to give you this." He pulled the photograph from his mailbag and held it out with both hands, presenting it the way Evelyn had presented it to him. Thomas took it with trembling hands that could barely hold onto the frame. He looked down at the image of his family from so long ago, and a sob escaped his throat that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "I remember this day," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "It was summer just before school started. Dad was home on leave. We went to the park and fed the ducks, and then we came home, and Mom made lemonade and we sat in the garden. The photographer was just walking by, and Dad called him over, said we needed to capture this perfect moment. I remember Mom laughing and trying to fix my hair, and Dad telling me to smile big, even though I'd just lost my tooth." He traced his mother's face with one finger, his touch infinitely gentle. "I was 8 years old. It was the last happy day I can remember before everything fell apart. Your mother wanted you to know something," Henry said gently, reaching into his pocket for the note Evelyn had pressed into his hands. "She wanted you to understand what happened and why." He handed over the note, and Thomas read it with tears falling onto the paper, his lips moving silently as he absorbed each word. When he finished, he pressed the note to his chest and looked up at the darkening sky, as if trying to see through to wherever his mother might be now. "She loved me," he said, his voice breaking. "Even when she couldn't speak, even when she was trapped in that cottage, even when she couldn't be with me physically, she loved me. She never stopped being my mother. She was very proud of you," Henry added. "Proud of the man you became, the family you built, the way you carried on despite not having the answers you needed. She watched over you all your life, Thomas. You were never alone, even when you felt most abandoned." Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, suddenly looking years younger despite his age and grey hair. "I've spent my whole life wondering what happened, why she disappeared, whether it was something I did, something I said, whether I could have saved her somehow. The relatives who raised me were kind but distant, never wanted to talk about her, said it wasn't healthy for a child to dwell on tragedy. But I needed to know. I needed to understand. And now you do, Henry said. Your mother was waiting for a letter from your father. His last letter, written the night before he died. It was destroyed in a fire at the post office, and without it, she couldn't find peace. She couldn't let go and move forward. She became trapped between worlds, caught in eternal waiting. But today, somehow, that letter found its way back, and I delivered it to her, 30 years too late, but still in time. She read your father's words, and they freed her. She can finally rest now. Thomas looked at Henry with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with lingering confusion. But how? How is any of this possible? How did you find a letter that was destroyed 30 years ago? How was my mother still there, still waiting after all this time? It defies everything I understand about reality. Henry thought about all the explanations he could give, all the rational ways he could try to make sense of what had happened. But in the end, he simply repeated what Evelyn had written. Love is the strongest force in any world. Your mother's love for your father and his love for her was strong enough to hold her in place for 30 years, strong enough to bring that lost letter back from wherever lost things go, strong enough to make sure you finally got the answers you needed. I don't understand how it works, Thomas. I just know that it does. Thomas laughed through his tears, a sound of relief and release. My son always said I was obsessed with the mail service for a reason. He never understood why I made sure he learned about the importance of completing deliveries, why I insisted his son Tommy understand the sacred trust that mailmen carry. But somehow I knew, somehow I always knew that one day a letter would arrive that would change everything. Young Tommy came running up the post office steps, his grandmother close behind him. The old woman who had given Henry the envelope that morning looked different now, lighter somehow, as if a burden she'd been carrying had finally been lifted. She pulled her son into a fierce hug, then looked at Henry with eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for having faith when faith seemed foolish, for completing a delivery that everyone else would have said was impossible. You freed our family from 30 years of not knowing, 30 years of carrying questions that had no answers." Tommy tugged on Henry's sleeve, his young face solemn, but his eyes bright with understanding that seemed far beyond his years. "There will be more, Mr. Patterson," the boy said quietly. "More letters that need delivering, more mysteries that need solving. Grandma says you have a gift for finding the stories that matter most, for completing the deliveries that change people's lives." Henry felt a shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't fear or dread. It was something closer to anticipation, to purpose, to the understanding that his life had just taken a turn towards something extraordinary. For 23 years, he'd thought he understood his job: deliver the mail, rain or shine, to every house in Willowbrook. Bring people their bills and letters and packages, complete his route, go home, repeat the next day. But perhaps there had always been another layer to it, one he was only now beginning to see. Perhaps every letter carried more than just words on paper. Perhaps every delivery was an opportunity to complete something important, to bring closure, to heal old wounds, to connect past and present in ways that defied rational explanation, but were no less real for that. "I'm ready," Henry said, looking at the Burke family gathered on the post office steps. "Whatever comes next, whatever impossible deliveries need to be made, I'm ready. That's what I do. I'm the mailman, and I'll make sure every letter reaches its destination, no matter how long it takes or how strange the journey." Thomas pulled him into a sudden, fierce hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me back my mother, even if only for a moment. Thank you for freeing her so she can finally be at peace. Thank you for completing what no one else could." As Thomas pulled back, Henry saw that the man's face had transformed. The years of worry and wondering seemed to have melted away, leaving him looking younger, lighter, more at peace than he'd probably felt since he was 8 years old. He held the photograph of his family like the treasure it was, and Henry knew that image would have a place of honor in Thomas's home, a reminder that love endured beyond death, beyond time, beyond understanding. Have you subscribed yet? Don't miss the next mystery Henry uncovers. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell and tell us in the comments what impossible delivery you think Henry should make next. The Burke family walked away into the gathering darkness, Tommy holding his grandfather's hand on one side and his father's hand on the other, 3 generations connected by love and loss, and now, finally, by understanding. Henry watched them go, then climbed the post office steps and let himself in with his key. The sorting room was quiet and dark, lit only by the street lamps shining through the windows. He walked to his sorting station, intending to prepare for tomorrow's route, but stopped short when he saw what was waiting there. His colleague Susan must have left them before going home, but she couldn't have known what they meant, couldn't have understood their significance. On his sorting counter lay a dozen envelopes, all yellowed with age, all addressed in various styles of old-fashioned handwriting, all with addresses that seemed to shimmer and shift when he looked at them too directly. Henry's heart began to race as he approached the pile. He picked up the top envelope and squinted at the address, watching as the letters gradually became clear. Meadowbrook Cottage, Willow Lane, for Michael Stevens. He knew that house, knew that name. Michael Stevens was a reclusive old man in his 70s who lived alone and never received mail beyond the occasional bill or advertisement. What letter could possibly be waiting for him? What mystery did his life hold? The second envelope was addressed to Rose Cottage, Garden Lane, for Eleanor Martinez. Henry knew Eleanor as well, a woman in her 60s who ran the village library and always had a kind word for everyone, but kept her private life intensely private. The third was for Timothy Chen, the old bakery, Main Street. Mrs. Chen's husband, who had died 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack that shocked the entire village. Every envelope represented a mystery, a story waiting to be completed, a wound waiting to be healed. Henry spread them out on the counter, looking at each one, wondering what impossible truths they contained and how he was supposed to deliver messages to some people who were already dead. But then he remembered Evelyn, remembered how she'd been waiting for 30 years for a letter from her dead husband, remembered how love had been strong enough to make the impossible real. Perhaps these letters weren't for the dead at all. Perhaps they were for the living people left behind, the ones carrying grief and questions and unfinished business. Perhaps his job was to be the bridge between past and present, between the dead and the living, between loss and closure. As if in answer to his thoughts, one of the envelopes began to glow with a soft, warm light, the one addressed to Michael Stevens. Henry picked it up carefully, and the moment his fingers touched the paper, he knew where he needed to go tomorrow. He knew that Michael Stevens was waiting for something, even if the old man didn't know it himself. He knew that somewhere in Michael's past was an unfinished story that needed completing. Henry carefully gathered all the envelopes and placed them in his mailbag. They would be his priority tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days it took to deliver them all. The regular mail could wait. These special deliveries, these impossible letters that defied time and logic, were more important than bills or advertisements or ordinary correspondence. He locked up the post office and began walking home through the quiet village streets. Lights glowed warmly in windows, smoke rose from chimneys, and the smell of dinners cooking drifted on the evening air. Everything looked normal and peaceful, a village settling down for the night. But Henry knew now that beneath that peaceful surface lay layers of mystery and magic, stories waiting to be told, connections waiting to be made. When he reached his apartment above the bakery, Mrs. Chen's daughter Emily was locking up the shop for the night. She looked up with her usual cheerful smile, but tonight Henry thought he detected something else in her expression. Hope, maybe, or anticipation, as if she knew something was about to change. "Evening, Mr. Patterson," she called up to him. "You're even later than usual today. Must have been quite a route." "Had a special delivery to make," Henry replied, pausing on the stairs. "Sometimes the most important letters take much longer to deliver than you'd expect." Emily studied him with an expression that reminded Henry suddenly of young Tommy Burke, as if she could see more than she should be able to see. My mother used to say that a good mailman delivers more than just paper and ink. She said the best mailmen deliver hope and closure and sometimes even miracles. I think maybe she was right about that. Henry felt his throat tighten with emotion. Your mother was a wise woman. She still is, Emily said softly. Even though Dad's been gone 5 years, she still talks to him every morning, still sets out 2 cups of tea, still waits for something, though she won't say what. Maybe one day she'll get whatever it is she's waiting for. Henry thought about the envelope addressed to Timothy Chen and wondered if tomorrow he might be delivering that long-awaited something to Mrs. Chen. But he just smiled at Emily and wished her a good night before climbing the rest of the stairs to his apartment. Inside his modest home, Henry made tea and sat by his window overlooking the village. From this vantage point, he could see most of Willowbrook spread out before him like a patchwork quilt stitched together with light and shadow. The church steeple rose dark against the starlit sky. The village green was empty, except for a few cats prowling for mice. The winding streets he'd walked for 23 years stretched out in familiar patterns. How many other mysteries were hidden in those houses? How many people were waiting for letters that would never come through ordinary channels? How many stories needed completing, wounds needed healing, questions needed answering? The thought should have been overwhelming, but instead, Henry felt energized, purposeful, more alive than he'd felt in years. He pulled out the photograph of the Whitmore family and propped it on his windowsill where he could see it. 3 happy faces frozen in time, unaware of the tragedy that would soon tear them apart, but also unaware of the miracle that would bring them closure 30 years later. Evelyn had waited so long, suffered so much, but in the end, love had been strong enough to bring her peace. If love could do that for Evelyn and James, what might it do for the other people in Willowbrook? What miracles might be waiting in the envelopes in his mailbag? What impossible deliveries might he complete in the days and weeks and months ahead? Henry finished his tea and prepared for bed, but sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept returning to Clearwater Cottage, to Evelyn's face when she finally held her husband's letter, to the way the cottage had crumbled when she no longer needed to maintain it through sheer will and love. He thought about Thomas Burke's expression of profound relief and gratitude. He thought about young Tommy's knowing eyes and his prediction that there would be more deliveries like this one. When he finally slept, Henry dreamed of letters flying through the air like birds, each one glowing with soft light, each one seeking the person who needed it most. He dreamed of walking down roads that didn't exist on any map, knocking on doors that opened onto impossible places, delivering messages that healed and connected and completed. He dreamed of being more than just a mailman, of being a bridge between worlds, a healer of old wounds, a completer of unfinished stories. And when he woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through his window, Henry felt no fear or doubt about what lay ahead. He felt only purpose and determination. There were letters to deliver, mysteries to solve, stories to complete, and he was exactly the right person for the job. The morning sorting had already been done when Henry arrived at the post office, but his regular route could wait. Today was for special deliveries. He picked up his mailbag with its collection of impossible envelopes and stepped out into the crisp autumn morning. The first envelope, the one addressed to Michael Stevens, seemed to pulse with warmth against his side, as if eager to reach its destination. Meadowbrook Cottage sat at the end of Willow Lane, a neat stone house with a well-tended garden that was Michael's pride and joy. Henry had delivered here hundreds of times over the years, usually leaving bills in the mailbox by the gate because Michael rarely answered his door. But today felt different. Today, Henry walked right up to the front door and knocked firmly. He heard movement inside, the sound of someone approaching slowly and cautiously. The door opened a crack, and Michael Stevens peered out with his usual suspicious expression. He was a man in his early 70s, lean and weathered, with sharp eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "Don't usually get mail on Wednesdays," Michael said gruffly, not opening the door any wider. "Got something special today, Mr. Stevens," Henry replied, pulling out the glowing envelope. Not sure how it ended up in our sorting room, but it's addressed to you. Looks quite old, actually. I thought you might want to receive it personally, rather than have me leave it in your mailbox." Michael's face went pale. His hand, reaching out to take the envelope, trembled visibly. He took it from Henry and turned it over, examining both sides carefully. When he saw the return address, he made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "This is impossible," he whispered. "This is absolutely impossible." "Is it from someone you know?" Henry asked gently. "It's from my brother," Michael said, his voice breaking. "My younger brother David. He went missing in action in Vietnam in 1970. They never found his body, never sent me anything except the standard notification. I've spent 45 years wondering what happened to him, if he thought of me at the end, if he knew how much I loved him." His hands shook so badly that he almost dropped the envelope. How can this be real? How can a letter from a dead man, written 45 years ago, suddenly appear now? "I don't know how it's possible," Henry said honestly. "But I delivered a letter yesterday that had been lost for 30 years, and it brought peace to someone who desperately needed it. Maybe this letter has been waiting for the right time to arrive. Maybe your brother's words needed to reach you now, today, for a reason we don't understand." Michael stared at the envelope for a long moment, then looked up at Henry with tears streaming down his weathered face. Would you stay while I read it? I don't think I can do this alone." Henry nodded and followed Michael inside. The cottage was neat and sparsely furnished, everything in its place, but with none of the warmth or personality that made a house a home. It was the dwelling of a man who was surviving, but not truly living. They sat in the small living room, and Michael carefully opened the envelope with shaking hands. The letter inside was written on standard military stationery, the kind soldiers used in Vietnam. The handwriting was rushed but legible, the writing of someone who knew time was short. Michael read slowly, his lips moving silently, tears falling onto the paper and smudging the ink in places. When he finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, just holding the letter against his chest. "He wrote this the day before his unit was ambushed," Michael finally said. "The day before he died. He never had a chance to mail it, never had a chance to say goodbye properly. But somehow, impossibly, his words have reached me now." He looked at Henry with wonder in his eyes. "He told me he wasn't afraid of dying. He said he was proud to serve, proud to be my brother, proud of the bond we shared. And then," Michael's voice broke, "then he told me something I've needed to hear for 45 years. He told me to stop hiding. He said that if he didn't make it home, I needed to promise to live a full life for both of us. Not to shut myself away in grief, but to find joy and love and connection. To honor his memory by actually living, not just existing." Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "But I did exactly what he didn't want me to do. When I got the notification that he was missing, presumed dead, something inside me just shut down. I came back to Willowbrook, bought this cottage, and I've been hiding here ever since. Living, but not really living. Going through the motions, but never really connecting with anyone or anything. I convinced myself I was honoring his memory, but really I was just running from the pain. It's never too late to change that," Henry said gently. "Your brother's letter found its way to you now, after all these years, because you needed to hear his message. He's giving you permission to let go of the grief and start truly living again." Michael looked down at the letter again, reading certain passages over. "You're right," he said, his voice stronger now, more determined. "You're absolutely right. I'm 73 years old, but that doesn't mean my life is over. David didn't get to have a future, but I still do. I can still make connections, still find joy, still live the full life he wanted for me." But what do you think will happen to Michael now? Will he finally find the courage to live fully? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you can follow Henry's journey through all the mysteries of Willowbrook. Henry stood to leave, but Michael called him back. "Wait, please. How did you know to bring this to me? How did you know it was important enough to deliver personally, rather than just leaving it in my mailbox?" "Honestly, Mr. Stevens, I can't fully explain it," Henry admitted. "Let's just say I've learned that some letters carry more than just words on paper. They carry hope and healing, and sometimes the keys to setting people free from prisons of their own making. When I picked up your letter this morning, I knew it needed to be delivered with care and respect for what it meant. Michael walked Henry to the door, but this time he opened it wide rather than hiding behind it. As Henry stepped out into the garden, Michael called after him, "Mr. Patterson, thank you. Thank you for being the kind of mailman who sees people, not just addresses. Thank you for completing this delivery, even though it must have seemed strange or impossible." As Henry walked back toward the main village, he heard something that made him smile. Michael was calling out to his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, asking if she'd like some help with her garden work. The old man's voice was tentative but warm, reaching out after decades of isolation. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. The letter had done its work. Henry pulled out the next envelope. Eleanor Martinez, at Rose Cottage. He knew Eleanor well. She'd been the village librarian for as long as he could remember, a quiet woman who loved books more than people, or so it seemed. She was always friendly in a distant sort of way, but she never let anyone get too close. What mystery did her life hold? What letter was waiting for her? Rose Cottage was aptly named, with climbing roses covering nearly every surface of the small brick house. Eleanor answered the door almost immediately, as if she'd been watching for him. She was in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Good morning, Henry," she said, her voice pleasant but reserved. "I wasn't expecting any deliveries today." "I have something special for you," Henry replied, holding out the envelope. "It arrived in yesterday's sorting, but I wanted to deliver it personally." Eleanor took the envelope and her face went completely white. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "This handwriting," she whispered. "I haven't seen this handwriting in 40 years. Would you like some privacy to read it?" Henry asked, but Eleanor shook her head. "No, please stay. If this is what I think it is, I might need—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. She led Henry into a living room that was exactly what you'd expect from a librarian. Every wall covered with bookshelves, a comfortable reading chair by the window, a sense of quiet order and careful curation. Eleanor sat down and opened the envelope with hands that had spent decades carefully handling fragile books, but now shook like leaves in a storm. The letter inside was written on delicate stationery, the paper thin and fragile. Eleanor read it slowly, and as she did, her carefully maintained composure began to crack. Tears fell silently down her cheeks, and her lips trembled as she absorbed whatever words the letter contained. When she finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, just holding the pages. Finally, she looked up at Henry with an expression of mingled pain and relief. "This is from my daughter," she said quietly. "My daughter Catherine, who died 40 years ago when she was just 16. She had leukemia. We fought it for 2 years, but in the end—" Eleanor had to pause and take a shaky breath. "In the end, we lost her." "I'm so sorry," Henry said, and he meant it with all his heart. "I never knew she'd written this," Eleanor continued. "She must have written it near the end when she knew she wasn't going to get better. She tells me—" Eleanor's voice broke. "She tells me she wasn't afraid. She says she'd had a good life, even if it was short. She says she loved me more than words could express, and she understood why I sometimes had to leave the hospital room when things got too hard. She forgave me for the times I couldn't be strong, for the times I broke down, for the times I wasn't the perfect mother she deserved." Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest. "But most importantly, she tells me to stop punishing myself. Somehow she knew, that I would spend the rest of my life blaming myself for not being able to save her, for every small mistake I made as a mother, for not being perfect. She tells me in this letter that I was a wonderful mother, that she was grateful for every moment we had together, and that I need to forgive myself and find joy again. She says—" Eleanor had to pause to compose herself. "She says she'll wait for me on the other side for as long as it takes, but she wants me to actually live my life before I get there. Not just exist, but truly live." Henry found himself thinking about Michael Stevens and his brother's similar message, about Evelyn Whitmore and her husband's last words. There seemed to be a pattern emerging. These impossible letters were all carrying the same basic message. Live. Truly live. Don't let grief or guilt or loss prevent you from finding joy and connection and purpose. Have you been living, Eleanor? Henry asked gently. Or have you been existing? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking around her book-filled room. I've been hiding, she finally admitted. For 40 years, I've been hiding in books and solitude, convincing myself that I was content, that I didn't need people or relationships or experiences beyond the stories I read. But really, I was just afraid. Afraid that if I let anyone too close, I'd lose them the way I lost Catherine. Afraid that if I allowed myself to be happy, I'd somehow be betraying her memory. So I became the quiet librarian who lived alone with her books, never letting anyone see the real me, never taking risks, never truly living. She looked down at her daughter's letter again. But Catherine doesn't want that for me. She never wanted that. She wants me to have friends, to take chances, to experience the world instead of just reading about it. She wants me to honor her memory by living fully, not by shutting myself away. It sounds like she's giving you permission to let go of the guilt, Henry observed. She is, Eleanor agreed, and I think I'm finally ready to accept that permission. I'm 65 years old. I could have 20 or 30 more years ahead of me. That's enough time to really live, to make connections, to experience things instead of just reading about them in books. Catherine would want that for me. She deserves to have a mother who honors her memory by embracing life, not hiding from it. As Henry left Rose Cottage, he saw Eleanor standing at her window, looking out at the village with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. It was an expression of possibility, of openness, of willingness to engage with the world, instead of just observing it from a safe distance. Another life changed, another person freed from a prison of grief and guilt. The day continued in this pattern. Henry delivered the letter to Timothy Chen at the bakery, and Mrs. Chen read her husband's words through tears of joy and sorrow mixed together. Timothy had written it knowing his heart was weak, preparing final words in case the end came suddenly. He told his wife how much he loved her, how proud he was of their daughter Emily, and most importantly, how he wanted his wife to find happiness again after he was gone. He'd hidden the letter somewhere, intending to update it regularly, but death had come too quickly, and the letter had been lost. Until now. Mrs. Chen stood in her bakery, surrounded by the ovens and mixing bowls that had been their shared passion, and she wept. But they were healing tears, releasing tears, the kind of tears that wash away old wounds rather than creating new ones. He wants me to live, she said to Henry, not just run this bakery like a memorial to him, but to actually live and find joy again. He says in this letter that I should consider selling the business if it makes me happy, or finding a partner to help run it, or even closing on Sundays to take time for myself. He says my happiness matters more than preserving everything exactly as it was when he was alive. By the time the sun was setting on Henry's second day of impossible deliveries, he'd completed 6 of the 12. 6 lives changed. 6 people freed from grief, guilt, or fear. 6 impossible letters delivered to people who desperately needed the messages they contained. Have you told someone you love them today? These stories remind us how precious and fragile life is. Share this video with someone special and subscribe to join Henry on every delivery. As he walked home through the twilight, his mailbag lighter but his heart fuller than ever, Henry reflected on what he was learning. These letters weren't random. They weren't accidents. Each one was arriving at exactly the right moment for the person who needed it. Michael Stevens had spent 45 years isolating himself, but he'd finally reached a point where he was ready to hear his brother's message and act on it. Eleanor Martinez had built walls around her heart for 4 decades, but she was finally ready to let them come down. Mrs. Chen had been running her bakery like a shrine for 5 years, but she was finally ready to consider that her husband would want her to find her own happiness. The letters were catalysts, Henry realized. They provided permission, closure, forgiveness, release. But they only worked because the recipients were ready, whether they knew it consciously or not. The letters came when the time was right, when the person was finally able to hear their message and act on it. which meant the remaining 6 letters in his bag were also arriving at exactly the right moment. 6 more people in Willowbrook were ready for transformation, ready to hear messages from the past that would free them to embrace the future. 6 more stories waiting to be completed, 6 more miracles waiting to happen. Henry climbed the stairs to his apartment feeling more purposeful than he'd ever felt in his entire 23 years as a mailman. This was what he was meant to do. Not just deliver bills and advertisements, but deliver hope and healing and closure. Not just check off addresses on a list, but change lives, complete stories, bridge the gap between past and present. The next morning, Henry woke early and prepared for another day of special deliveries. The 7th envelope was addressed to Old Mill House, River Road, for Samuel Price. Henry knew Samuel as a man in his 80s who'd made a fortune in business and then retired to Willowbrook to live out his days in luxury and isolation. He had everything money could buy, but seemed to enjoy none of it. What letter could possibly be waiting for him? Old Mill House was the largest residence in Willowbrook, a converted mill that Samuel had purchased and renovated to spectacular effect. Henry had never been inside, had only left mail in the elaborate mailbox by the front gate. But today he walked right up to the massive front door and rang the bell. A housekeeper answered, looking surprised to see the mailman at the door. "Deliveries go in the mailbox," she said curtly. "This one needs to be delivered personally to Mr. Price," Henry replied firmly. "It's important." The housekeeper looked skeptical, but went to fetch Samuel. Several minutes later, the old man himself appeared, leaning on a cane, his expression one of irritation at being disturbed. Samuel Price was a man who'd spent his life controlling everything around him, and unexpected interruptions were not welcome. "What's so important it couldn't wait in my mailbox?" he demanded. Henry held out the envelope without a word. Samuel took it impatiently, glanced at the address, and froze. His irritation vanished, replaced by shock and something that might have been fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly fragile. "It arrived in yesterday's sorting," Henry said. "I thought you'd want to receive it personally." Samuel stared at the envelope for a long moment, then dismissed his housekeeper with a wave. When she'd left, he looked at Henry with an expression that was hard to read. "You'd better come in." The interior of Old Mill House was as spectacular as rumored, all exposed beams and modern renovations seamlessly blended with historical features. But it felt cold, more like a museum than a home. Samuel led Henry to a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. "This letter," Samuel said, still holding it like it might explode, "is from my son Daniel, who died 20 years ago. We had a terrible fight the last time I saw him. He wanted to be an artist, and I told him he was being foolish, that he needed to join the family business and stop wasting his life on childish dreams. He left that day, and I never saw him again. 3 months later, he died in a car accident. We never reconciled. I never got to tell him I was sorry." Samuel's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting that sprawled across the page with artistic flourishes. Samuel read it slowly, and as he did, tears began to fall from his eyes. Henry had never seen this powerful, controlled man show any emotion, but now he wept openly. "He forgives me," Samuel whispered. "He says he understands I was afraid for his future, that I was trying to protect him, even if I went about it the wrong way. He says he never stopped loving me, even though he was angry and hurt. And he tells me," Samuel's voice broke, "he tells me that he became successful as an artist. Before he died, he'd sold several pieces, was starting to make a name for himself. He was proving me wrong, and he was happy about that. But he still wished we could have reconciled. He wished I could have seen his work and understood why art mattered so much to him." Samuel clutched the letter to his chest. "I spent 20 years thinking my son died hating me. 20 years convinced I'd destroyed our relationship with my stubborn pride and fear. But he didn't hate me. He understood. He forgave me. And now," Samuel looked around his elaborate empty house, "now I'm the one who needs to forgive myself and figure out what to do with the years I have left." "What do you think he'd want you to do?" Henry asked gently. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He'd want me to use my money for something meaningful, something that would help other young artists, other dreamers who have parents like me standing in their way. He'd want me to stop hiding in this big empty house and actually engage with the community. He'd want me to stop being afraid of connection just because it might lead to loss. He'd want me to live, really live, instead of just existing in luxury and isolation. As Henry left Old Mill House, he heard Samuel calling his lawyer, already beginning to make plans for an art foundation in his son's name. Another life changed, another person freed. The pattern continued through the remaining letters. Each one arrived at exactly the right moment for someone who needed permission to change, to heal, to let go of old wounds and embrace new possibilities. An elderly teacher received a letter from a former student she thought she'd failed, thanking her for lessons that had changed his life. A young widow received final words from her husband that released her from the promise never to remarry. A middle-aged man received a letter from his estranged father, finally explaining the truth behind their family's dysfunction and offering the apology that had never come during the father's lifetime. With each delivery, Henry saw the same transformation. Shock giving way to tears, tears giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to action. People who'd been stuck in patterns of grief, guilt, fear, or anger for years or decades suddenly found themselves freed to move forward. By the end of the week, all 12 impossible letters had been delivered. Henry's regular mailbag felt light and ordinary in comparison. But as he completed his normal Friday route, delivering bills and advertisements and ordinary correspondence, he noticed something extraordinary happening in Willowbrook. Michael Stevens had joined the Community Garden Committee and was helping plan next year's plantings. Eleanor Martinez had started a book club that met at the library every Tuesday evening, and it was already attracting a dozen regulars. Mrs. Chen had hired a part-time assistant at the bakery and was taking Sundays off to spend time with her daughter. Samuel Price had announced the creation of the Daniel Price Foundation for Young Artists, with a generous endowment and plans to offer scholarships and studio space. The ripple effects of 12 impossible letters were spreading through the entire village, changing the atmosphere from one of quiet resignation to one of renewed possibility. People who'd been isolated were reaching out. People who'd been stuck were moving forward. People who'd been existing were starting to truly live, and Henry realized that this was just the beginning. If 12 letters could transform 12 lives, and those transformations could ripple outward to touch dozens or hundreds more, what might happen if the impossible deliveries continued? What if this was his true calling, not just to deliver ordinary mail, but to be a catalyst for healing and connection and change? As if in answer to his thoughts, Henry arrived at the post office on Monday morning to find a new stack of yellowed envelopes waiting at his sorting station. Not 12 this time, but 20. 20 more impossible letters, 20 more mysteries, 20 more chances to change lives and complete stories. Young Tommy Burke was standing in the corner of the post office with his grandmother, watching Henry discover the new letters. The boy walked over with that same knowing look in his eyes that seemed far too mature for his age. "The village mailman," Tommy said softly. "That's who you are now. Not just any mailman, but the one who delivers hope and healing, the one who completes what others think is impossible. Are you ready?" Henry looked down at the stack of impossible letters, felt their warmth, saw how the addresses shimmered and shifted until he focused on them. He thought about Evelyn Whitmore, finally freed after 30 years of waiting. He thought about all the lives he'd already changed in just 1 week. He thought about all the stories still waiting to be completed, all the wounds still waiting to be healed. "I'm ready," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "These letters have been waiting long enough. It's time to deliver them." Tommy grinned and gave him a thumbs up. "Some of them are going to be harder than the others," he warned. "Some of the addresses might not exist anymore. Some of the people might not be ready to hear their message. But you'll figure it out. You're good at this." As Tommy and his grandmother left, Henry carefully loaded the 20 new impossible letters into his mailbag alongside his regular mail. The bag felt heavier than ever, but it was a good weight, a purposeful weight. He was carrying more than just paper and ink. He was carrying hope, closure, forgiveness, freedom. He was carrying the keys that would unlock prisons of grief and guilt and fear. The village mailman stepped out into the autumn morning, ready for whatever impossible deliveries lay ahead. The streets of Willowbrook stretched before him, familiar and yet full of mystery. Every house held a story. Every person carried wounds that might need healing. And somewhere in his bag were the letters that would make miracles happen, one delivery at a time. Because love was the strongest force in any world. Love could bridge the gap between life and death, between past and present, between loss and closure. Love could make the impossible real. And Henry Patterson, faithful mailman of Willowbrook Village, had somehow become the vessel through which that love flowed, delivering it to the people who needed it most. As he walked his route, Henry thought about all the lives he'd touched in just 1 week, all the tears shed, all the smiles borne, all the transformations witnessed. And he thought about all the lives still waiting to be touched, all the stories still waiting to be completed, all the miracles still waiting to happen. This was his gift. This was his calling, this was his purpose, and he would fulfill it faithfully, one impossible delivery at a time, for as long as the letters kept arriving and people kept needing the messages they carried. The village mailman continued his rounds, his bag full of mysteries and his heart full of purpose, ready to deliver not just letters but hope itself to every corner of Willowbrook and perhaps beyond. Because in a world that often felt cold and disconnected, where grief and guilt could trap people for decades, where love and forgiveness seemed impossible to find, sometimes all it took was one letter, arriving at exactly the right moment, delivered by exactly the right person, to change everything. And Henry Patterson, the village mailman, was exactly the right person for this extraordinary job. Thank you so much for joining us on Henry's incredible journey. If you loved this story, make sure to smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another mysterious delivery from the village mailman. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of love and second chances. What impossible letter do you wish you could receive? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, remember, it's never too late for the right message to arrive.